They said she wasn't supposed to be there that day. The mission was meant for the Bravo unit, fast, armed, and trained for the desert ambush. But fate has a strange sense of humor, doesn't it? Because on that cold morning, when the wind screamed through the broken village of Al-Kamir, it was Lieutenant Grace Carter who stepped into history. Nobody expected her name to echo across the world, or that a single silver medal pinned to her uniform would carry a story that shook every heart in her battalion and beyond. Grace wasn't the kind of soldier people noticed right away. She didn't bark orders, didn't swagger, didn't try to prove she belonged. But she listened, really listened, to every voice on the radio, every whisper of wind that carried danger. She'd joined the army because her father, a Vietnam veteran, once told her that courage wasn't about not being afraid. It was about standing still when fear screamed run. Grace never forgot that. It lived in her bones, quiet but burning. The mission began at dawn. They were moving supplies through a narrow valley, nothing unusual. But the air that day felt off. Even the birds were silent. The soldiers joked about it on the radio, calling it the calm before the chaos. Grace smiled but kept her eyes on the horizon. She had that sixth sense, the one that tells you something terrible is waiting, just out of sight. And when the first explosion hit, her instincts proved right. The blast came from the ridge above. Dust swallowed the convoy in seconds. Trucks burned. Men shouted. The world turned into fire and metal. Grace's Humvee spun sideways, slamming into a ditch. Her ears rang, her heart raced, and her training kicked in. She pulled herself out through the shattered window, coughing, bleeding from her arm. Around her, chaos was everywhere. Her team pinned down, snipers in the hills, radio lines jammed. Someone screamed for a medic. Someone else didn't scream at all. Grace scanned the ridge. Through the haze of smoke, she saw them. 3 insurgents armed with RPGs taking aim at the second truck. Inside that truck were 5 of her men. She didn't think, didn't plan. She just ran. With bullets snapping past her, she grabbed the fallen gun of a wounded soldier and slid behind a rusted barrel. Every sound was sharper now, every second longer. Her hands shook, but her eyes, those steady gray eyes, never blinked. She aimed, fired, hit one, then another. But the third man disappeared behind the rocks. "Carter, fall back!" Her sergeant yelled through static. But she couldn't. The enemy wasn't retreating, they were circling. That's when she saw it. The hill above them wasn't just a position. It was a trap. Wires half buried in the sand leading toward a fuel truck. Grace's breath caught. They weren't trying to take prisoners. They were trying to ignite everything. She sprinted back toward her team, waving her arms. "It's wired!" she screamed. "It's all wired!" Her voice cut through the gunfire. Men turned. Confusion spread. And then, the second explosion ripped the sky apart. The blast knocked her off her feet. When she opened her eyes, the world was ringing again. Smoke poured from the valley floor. Her uniform was scorched, her helmet gone, her radio dead. Somewhere through the haze, she could hear Private Daniels calling for help. Grace crawled toward the voice, dragging herself over burning debris. When she reached him, she saw his leg pinned under twisted metal. He was crying, gasping, bleeding badly. Grace's hands trembled as she tried to free him. "Stay with me," she whispered. "You're not going anywhere." It took her everything, muscle, grit, will to pull him free. But when she did, she realized something horrifying. The fire was spreading toward the fuel truck. If it went up, it would take the whole battalion with it. She had seconds to choose, save herself or stop it. She chose neither. She chose them. Grace lifted Daniels onto her shoulders and stumbled toward a safer spot. Every step felt like walking through fire. The radio crackled again, someone shouting, "Carter, where are you? We're pulling out!" But she wasn't listening. She laid Daniels down behind a wall of sandbags, handed him her canteen, and turned back toward the fire. Her lungs screamed. Her legs barely moved, but she kept going. She could see the wires again, sparking, and in that moment, as the heat licked her skin and the world narrowed to a single heartbeat, she made the decision that would earn her the medal and the nightmares that came with it. She grabbed a fallen rifle, used the stock to rip the wires loose, praying the whole time. The blast didn't come. Somehow, against all odds, it didn't trigger. The line was cut. The fire slowed. The truck didn't blow. But as she turned, she saw movement, a shadow in the smoke. The third insurgent, the one she'd missed, was raising his weapon. Grace had no cover, no strength left, and no time. A single shot echoed. But it wasn't hers. The enemy fell. Behind him stood Sergeant Hale, his face streaked with ash and disbelief. He looked at her like he'd just seen a ghost. "You're insane," he said, shaking his head. "You just saved the whole damn unit." Grace didn't feel like a hero. She felt like she could barely breathe. But when the medics arrived and the fires finally died down, they counted the survivors, almost all of them alive because of her. Back at base, word spread fast. "Carter stopped the chain," they said. "She saved 20 men." The commanding officer ordered her to report for debriefing, but she barely heard him. She was thinking of the faces she couldn't save, the ones still out there in the smoke. The medal would come later, they told her. A silver star, maybe even higher. But to Grace, it felt heavy before it even touched her chest. Weeks passed. The headlines called her the Iron Angel. Reporters wanted interviews, politicians wanted photo ops. But the soldiers, the ones who'd been there, just called her ma'am with quiet respect. Every time someone mentioned the medal, Grace changed the subject. She didn't want glory. She wanted peace. Yet something about that day kept gnawing at her. The trap had been too precise. The wires too expertly hidden. Someone had known their route. Someone inside had tipped them off, and that's when the story took a turn no one expected. One night, while reviewing mission footage, Grace noticed something, tiny, almost invisible. A flicker on the convoy's drone feed, a movement at their own supply checkpoint, hours before departure, a shadow that didn't belong. She paused, rewound, zoomed in. Her blood went cold. It wasn't just bad luck. Someone had betrayed them, but who? The next morning, Grace went to her commanding officer with what she'd found. He dismissed it at first, said it was dust on the lens, interference. But Grace knew what she saw, and she couldn't let it go. Not when lives had been lost. Not when something inside her whispered that the story wasn't over. That night, she snuck into the comms tent and pulled up the internal logs. Message records, transmission codes. One file stood out, an encrypted signal sent just before the convoy left base. It wasn't from any authorized source. It was from inside their own unit. Grace stared at the code signature, her heart pounding harder with each line that decrypted. When the final name appeared on the screen, she felt the air leave her lungs. It couldn't be. The name belonged to someone she trusted more than anyone else in the battalion, and that's where everything she thought she knew about bravery, loyalty and honor began to unravel. Grace stared at the glowing name on the screen, her fingers frozen above the keyboard. Sergeant Hale, the same man who had saved her life on that battlefield, the one who had called her insane with a grin right after shooting the insurgent. Her stomach twisted. It couldn't be him. He'd fought beside her, risked his life for the team, but the timestamp didn't lie. The signal had gone out under his access code less than an hour before the convoy rolled out. She sat there in the hum of the tent, the computer fans spinning like a whisper. The desert outside was quiet, too quiet. Grace backed up the file, slipped the drive into her vest, and stepped outside into the night. The sky was black velvet, filled with stars that didn't seem to care about human things like betrayal. Hale's quarters were only 50 yards away. Every step toward them felt heavier than the last. When she reached his tent, he was awake, cleaning his rifle under a dim lamp. He looked up, surprised. "Carter couldn't sleep?" he asked casually. "Not exactly," she said, trying to keep her voice even. "Can we talk?" He nodded, motioning for her to sit. But she didn't. She just looked at him, really looked. His uniform sleeves were rolled up, his expression calm, almost too calm. "I was going through the comms logs," she began. "I found a transmission from our base to the insurgents. Same frequency, same pattern as their ambush signals." Hale's hands froze mid-motion. "And?" "It came from inside our unit," she said. "From your terminal." The silence stretched thin between them. The only sound was the faint ticking of the metal lantern. Hale's jaw tightened. Then he sighed, long and low, like someone letting go of a secret that's been poisoning them. "You weren't supposed to find that," he said quietly. Grace's pulse thudded in her ears. "So it's true." He looked up at her, his eyes strangely tired. "It's not what you think." "Then make me understand," she said, stepping closer. Hale leaned back, rubbing a hand over his face. "Command sent us into that valley blind. They knew it was a red zone. The coordinates were wrong, the route exposed. I warned them 3 times. They wouldn't listen. So I made contact with someone local, thought I could buy us safe passage. But they turned on us. They took the money and set the trap anyway." Grace blinked. "You tried to negotiate with the enemy?" "I tried to save us," he said sharply. "Half of us would have been dead before we even reached the ridge." "I thought I could outsmart them." Her chest tightened. "You went rogue. You gambled with all our lives." He shook his head. "I gambled to protect them." "You think Command would ever admit their mistake? You think anyone would have listened to me?" Grace wanted to scream, but her throat felt locked. She thought of Daniels, the men she'd dragged from the fire, the faces that still haunted her dreams. "You almost killed us all," she said. "And you let me believe it was an ambush." "I didn't mean for it to happen," he said, voice cracking. "When it went wrong, I ran toward the fight. I tried to fix it." Grace felt the air between them grow colder. "And when you shot that last insurgent?" she asked softly. "Was that to save me or to bury the truth?" He didn't answer, and that was all she needed to know. She stepped back, her hand drifting toward her sidearm. Hale noticed. His eyes flicked to her holster, then back to her face. "You gonna turn me in?" he asked. "I have to," she said. He nodded slowly, sadness replacing fear. "Then you'd better do it fast." Suddenly, the light outside the tent shifted, a beam of headlights cutting through the darkness. Military vehicles, too many. Grace glanced outside and froze. Command had arrived, early. Somehow they already knew. Hale cursed under his breath. "They're not here for me," he said bitterly. "They're here to make sure the story stays buried." Grace looked at him, confused. "What are you talking about?" "Carter," he said, grabbing her arm. "You don't get it. That route, we weren't supposed to survive. The whole convoy was bait. They wanted a show of force gone wrong so they could justify the next strike zone. You blew the plan when you stopped the explosion." Grace's mind reeled. "That's insane, is it?" he hissed. "Think about it. Why send a transport team through a known red zone? Why were our maps outdated? Why was the drone feed jammed? You think that's bad luck?" The headlights grew brighter, dust swirling around the approaching trucks. Grace's instincts screamed. She didn't know who to trust anymore. Hale might have been lying, or he might have been the only one telling the truth. He turned to her, eyes fierce. "You want to survive this, Carter? Then you need to run, now." But Grace didn't run, not yet. She stepped toward the table, pulled the flash drive from her vest, and slammed it down. "If what you're saying is true," she said, "then we both need proof." Hale hesitated, then grabbed a small satchel from his locker. Documents, radio logs, maps. "This is all I've got," he said. "Names, dates, enough to blow it open." Outside, doors slammed. Voices shouted orders. Grace's heart hammered. Hale looked at her one last time. "If they find me, they'll kill me. But if they find you with this, you're done too." Before she could answer, a burst of gunfire ripped through the night. Glass shattered. Hale grabbed his weapon, pushing her toward the back exit. "Go!" he yelled. "I'll hold them off." Grace stumbled into the dark, clutching the satchel and the flash drive. Behind her, she heard the roar of engines, the crack of rifles, Hale's final shout cut short. Then, silence. She ran until her legs gave out, collapsing behind a dune miles from camp. The horizon was turning gray with dawn. She looked down at the satchel, her hands trembling. Inside were pages, some stamped confidential, others marked with red ink. One page in particular made her blood run cold. It listed the convoy's route and the words, "Operational risk justified." They had planned it. Everything. Grace didn't return to base. Not that day, not ever. She disappeared into the network of field hospitals and refugee convoys moving under different names. But the files, those she kept safe. Weeks later, the story leaked. No one knew how. But a reporter in D.C. published a piece titled, "The Medal That Changed Everything." The article exposed the mission, the false intel, the loss of soldiers who'd been written off as collateral. Command called it fake news. The investigation was inconclusive, but people started asking questions. And one photo, one of Grace, standing in a burned-out valley with soot on her face and a half-broken medal on her chest, circulated everywhere. She never came forward to confirm it. She didn't have to. The medal she'd earned became more than medal and ribbon. It became a question about who gets to decide what courage means, about how far truth is allowed to go. Years later, when a journalist tracked her down living quietly in Montana, she didn't deny a thing. "I didn't change the world," she said softly. "I just refused to let them bury what was left of it." Her bravery had stunned her battalion once, but the truth she carried stunned a nation. And in the end, that small silver medal wasn't a reward, it was a reminder that real heroes don't fight for medals. They fight for the moments when doing the right thing costs everything and they do it anyway.